Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for coming out to listen to me. Wait, let me see who's in the audience. I don't know who I'm speaking to. Are there developers in the audience? Anybody here write code? Okay, we have developers. Yay. Anybody know Stack Overflow? Should I introduce that? Should I explain what that is? Mostly developers. How many people are sort of like in business but not really technical or coders? A few of you. Okay, so I'm sorry if I put you to sleep. Stack Overflow, I'll introduce myself a little bit first. I started Stack Overflow 10 years ago. I've been in the software industry for a really, really long time. Since I graduated college, I went to work for Microsoft. I worked for a few other companies. I started my first company, which is Fog Creek Software, in the year 2000, 18 years ago. And Fog Creek Software has turned into 3 different companies. Stack Overflow, which I'm now heading. Trello, which was sold to Atlassian, became part of Atlassian. So if you've used Trello, that came from Fog Creek. And the current product is called Glitch. And Glitch is a very friendly software development community for people mostly learning how to code, but for social coding. So those are the 3 companies. 10 years ago, I started Stack Overflow, and it really is the 10-year anniversary. But rather than measuring our history in years, we like to measure it in how many times we helped people get out of the Vim editor that they got into by mistake. Because if you've ever used Unix, you sometimes find that you're in Vim and none of the normal keystrokes work. So that is 1.7 million times. So we're now on our 1.7 millionth Vim anniversary of Stack Overflow. That's pretty cool. I had a co-founder named Jeff Atwood. He's a blogger. His blog was called Coding Horror. Given that his blog name was Coding Horror, it might have been a bad idea to have him be in charge of the coding. But it worked out, okay, I guess. The code was fine. In Stack Overflow, it held up. And speaking in this large room actually reminds me of the first time I ever asked that question of like, hey, does anybody use Stack Overflow? And you may have noticed that there was some snickering when I asked that question, a little bit of laughing, because it's become a standard part of a programmer's toolkit. It's impossible to code without coming across Stack Overflow, many, many times a day, and probably you just have a window open on your browser that is probably showing you something on Stack Overflow if you're writing code. But at the time that we launched, we had no idea that it was going to become this big. And we were invited to a conference that Microsoft was putting on in Las Vegas. And it was the biggest conference I'd ever been to. And the room, I was told there were 5,000 people in the audience. The room was the size of like Ireland, I think, is a good approximation. The hotel was the kind of hotel that other hotels go to when they go on vacation. I mean, it was a really, really huge, huge audience. And before we went out on, and the only reason we were there, by the way, is not because anybody had ever used Stack Overflow, because it was new, but because we were, I think, the only website in the world to use Microsoft technology, ASP.NET, MVC. And so it was sort of casting around for somebody that was using it at scale and came across us. And I said to Jeff, I heard this thing that you should do. You should go out, you should ask the audience if they've ever heard of your product before you start, and just, it's kind of more interactive, get a show of hands. And Jeff said, Joel, you can't do that. Do not even think of asking that question. There's going to be 7 people, and there's going to be 3 people. Do you want -2 people to raise their hands when you ask how many people use Stack Overflow? And I did it anyway, and I came out, I looked out, and there's this huge field of people. And when I asked how many people use Stack Overflow, it was like 1 out of 3. It was really good. I mean, it was thousands of people had already heard of us right in the beginning. And that was really the last time I could ask that question, because now people just laugh. It's like if you come out and say, does anybody use Air? How many people here use Air? It's too well known. We have a lot of Stack Overflow is an online community. It's a question and answer platform. People ask questions, other people answer them. But then millions of people sort of read those answers afterwards. So the number one type of people that we like to celebrate at Stack Overflow is the people answering the questions. And we have almost 100,000 people every month who write an answer to a question on Stack Overflow. By comparison, The number of people who make that kind of contribution to Wikipedia is less than 30,000. So a very, very heavy contributor base on Stack Overflow of people who take their time to write a long, detailed, and highly technical answer. And that's really lovely. One of those users is named John Skeet. Has anybody heard of John Skeet? He is at 35,000 answers that he has now written. 35,000 answers to questions, and it's still like less than 1/10% of what goes on the site, but he has 1 million reputation points in our little system, and even though he's written 35,000 answers, that adds up to 250 million people that he has helped. Because remember, the average answer on Stack Overflow, it helps the person who asked the question, but for the average question, 1,000 people find it on Google later, read it, and it helps them, and it saves them, and it moves them forward in programming. And we've done a lot of thinking about this, and we have an internal rule of thumb that we use that says that the average person that finds an answer on Stack Overflow will save 30 minutes. It will speed up their coding by 30 minutes if they had to figure it out on their own. And so when you think about the sheer number, there are 250 million times that John Skeet has helped people. There are probably, I don't know, let's say that there are 12 million, or let's say there's about 20 million. I'll make it 25 million to make it even. There's about 25 million programmers in the world. That means the average programmer in the world has personally been helped by John Skeet 10 times. And if it saved them a half hour each time, they've personally saved 5 hours because of just one person on Stack Overflow, never mind the other, everybody else. And a way of thinking about this is just his personal effort in Stack Overflow has moved the world 5 hours into the future. So we are now 5 hours ahead, in the timeline of human history of where we would have been if it weren't for John Skeet. And that's really kind of cool. John Skeet also, by the way, is sort of like the Chuck Norris of programming because of his 35,000 answers. People ask me, does John Skeet ever get a Stack Overflow? Get it? Get it? Because Stack Overflow is a kind of computer bug. He does not. He has never gotten an error. He can divide by 0, and it's fine. It's acceptable. But really, he's just one person, and there are, like I say, 100,000 people every month who write those answers, and that's really where the contribution comes from. Now, another kind of question I get from general purpose audiences is, what is going on here with Stack Overflow? Why is there something unusual about programmers? We launched another network called Stack Exchange, which has questions and answers on a lot of topics. And certain topics seem to work, like making beer, and other topics, and math, and DIY, home improvement projects, all that stuff works very well in Stack Overflow. Certain things you just don't really see, like heart surgery. There is no Stack Overflow for heart surgeons, where I guess I could imagine you're in the middle of surgery and you find something you don't expect. And I guess you probably wouldn't want to use a laptop computer because of hygiene and stuff, but you could ask the nurse, like, what is this little flappy thing here? Oh, mitral valve, is that what it is? Does he need it? That doesn't happen. And that does happen in programming, and that's why that's so funny, because programmers work on the assumption that they're not going to learn anything in advance. They're not going to read a book. Have you ever read a book? Come on. You're not going to learn something in advance of actually needing it. You're just going to start coding, and then you're going to, whatever problem you hit, you're just going to go on Google and say, how do I turn on the whatever LED lights? And the rest of the world, actually, they go to school, they learn how to do a thing, they get trained, maybe they take a certification course, they get tested to make sure they know how to do the thing, and then they're allowed to do it. But not with programming, and that's really what makes Stack Overflow work. It's almost like page faulting in knowledge, like, whoa, I don't know how to do a thing, let me find out. Let me ask the internets, and they will kind of help me. In fact, that may also be something that's special about programming that doesn't really apply to medicine, because I think there's sort of a canonical set of knowledge that you have about anatomy, if you're a heart surgeon, about what the various parts are in the heart and how they work together. I'm guessing. I don't really know. It could be, as far as I know, there's a big, grapefruit in there. But there's sort of this canonical knowledge that you have in these other fields. With programming, whatever that canonical knowledge is, it sort of changes all the time. You know, I wanted to learn how to program an Arduino. I went to the bookstore and found an Arduino book, and I looked at the copyright page and it said copyright 2013, and I thought, that's like, what are the chances that this can possibly help me? It's 5 years old. And so you don't even bother with that prior knowledge because the stuff changes so fast. And the fact that the stuff is changing so fast is what makes it really cool and really awesome, and what lets you use all kinds of new technologies that are coming out every day. And as a programmer, you're much more powerful if you're using tools that were invented 20 minutes ago than the tools from 5 years ago. If you had to accept credit card payments on your website using the tools from 5 years ago, it would take you months of work. But lately we invented this thing called Stripe, and it's one line of code to accept payments on your website. And so you always want to use the latest things, and the latest things are not what you were trained to do in computer science school, and they're not what you can find books about in a bookstore. You really just have to kind of, you know, you can read a tutorial, but even that's kind of out of date. And there was something that shipped a year ago, and it was really stupid, and they figured out a way to fix it. And so now everybody's doing it a different way, and the old way is stupid and also dangerous, and there's a security flaw if you do it that way. So we can't learn things in advance. And so programming really depends on Stack Overflow, because you kind of have to figure it out on your own. You have to ask questions, and then the answer to those questions is changing all the time. And you're able to build on kind of the knowledge of everybody else instead of just struggling along with the old basic stuff. So the books are kind of useful. One of the, I want to talk a little bit about some upcoming stuff on Stack Overflow and some of the stuff that we're working on now. One really cool thing that we discovered, and I guess we always knew this, is when you're a programmer by yourself, you're using other people's tools that are usually public tools. What are you using? You're using your compiler for your programming language. You're using frameworks and libraries and APIs. And essentially, you're using stuff that is available to the world. And when you have trouble with that stuff, there are answers on Stack Overflow that will get you started. But when you work inside a company or on a team or on a project that's maybe not an open source project, all that stuff that you're working on that's the internal knowledge is not documented, and it's not out there on Google, and you usually have to go find somebody and poke them and get them to give you an answer for how to do that thing that you want to do with that language or that library that's an internal library. And in fact, I think these have become a bigger part of the problem set. If you asked a programmer that's been working in Python for 6 months, they don't have Python questions anymore. They got it. They know Python. They don't have the Python questions. But internally, most of the questions that they do have are like, how do we do this thing internally? How do I deploy this thing to a server? Where are the servers? What's the official way to get a customer record from the database? What does this field mean in this table, in this database? All that kind of internal knowledge becomes more and more important as you get into an organization. And it gets to the point where a very large company that I will not mention by name, but let me just make up a name for it. Let's just call it Google, not the real name. And they have told me that it takes them a year for the average developer who starts working there to really learn enough to start writing production code, because their internal environment is so complicated and so complex and has all these languages and tools and libraries that you may not have outside, that it just takes a really long time to get started. And when you think about how somebody else told me, these two statistics don't really match, but somebody else told me that the average employment life cycle of a software developer in San Francisco is 9 months before they move on to their next gig. And you realize that you're not getting a lot of work out of developers if they really have to learn everything internally. So we started focusing on trying to figure out how can we get internal developers inside companies to be able to ask questions of their colleagues in a private and secure way. And that led us to two products, Stack Overflow for Teams, which is now available, and you can create it right on stackoverflow.com for your smaller team. And we even have an enterprise version called Stack Overflow Enterprise, and that's used by large companies like, I can't mention them, but the largest companies you can think of. And they provide that to their internal developers to ask internal questions about things, where also sort of the documentation sucks. It's very hard. You know, there have been sort of two different versions of how shall we teach internal developers how to use the internal tools. And the first version of let's make a wiki, and everybody will write documentation on the wiki. And then if the documentation is wrong, other people can update it, which never happens. But it's very hard to write documentation as a developer because, number one, you never know if you've written enough documentation, and you never know really when to stop. And so you can stop early, and nobody will say anything because nobody read your documentation, and nobody's going to. Or you can keep writing forever and just generate positive and positive words, and you waste a lot of time, and nobody reads your documentation then either. But the neat thing about the Stack Overflow idea is instead of writing documentation, just put up a few questions yourself, answer them yourself, and then wait for more questions to come in. And then you're writing exactly the documentation that people need because you're answering the exact questions people are having about whatever code library it is that you've created. So that's the idea behind Stack Overflow for Teams. There was sort of another version which said, oh, I know, let's just get a big Slack chat room. And then instead of having documentation, you can just search the Slack chat room. And I won't even go into describing why that doesn't work, but I think you know why it doesn't work. I want to, let's see, how much, let's talk about rules. One of the neat things about creating something like Stack Overflow, one of the interesting things about creating something like Stack Overflow is that you have to discover the rules that are going to make it work. You have to discover what the system is. And in fact, anybody trying to create any kind of community is going to discover that they need to make rules for that community. And the rules are usually not what you would expect. So for example, I went camping with some friends, and the rule I said was, don't bring anybody that you don't know into the tent area. And that was the only rule we had. And in fact, that turned out not to be a problem. That was not a thing that was going to happen. It turned out that the real problem was that people were tying knots in the hammocks just to make them higher or something. And that is not the way to make the hammock higher. And when you tie a knot in the hammock, it takes forever to get it out. So in fact, the actual rule that we needed was do not tie knots in the hammocks. But the rule that we had was some stupid thing that I thought made sense. The rules that you're going to need for your situation are always going to be not the obvious rules. And I'll give you I have kind of a long list of examples, but let's take kind of programming rules. I'll give you another kind of good example of the rules are not what you'd expect. If you go out to like nightclubs in New York, there's two nightclubs that I go to frequently. One is called Lebain and one is called Output. And Output is much better, and I didn't know why, but there was a weird rule at Output, and the rule was no cell phones. And you can have it in your pocket, you just can't take it out. And in fact, people will, if you take out your cell phone and you're like texting with your friends or something, somebody will come up to you and say, please put that away, and they will point to one of the 100 signs that say no cell phones. And I didn't know why I had this rule, I just thought they were weird. I thought they were like Luddites or they were anti-technology in some way. And I didn't understand why they had this rule, but I went along with it because it's a good club. And then I went to this other club called Lebain, which is way more famous, by the way, and is full of all kinds of tourists from, rich kids from wherever. And they're in there, and they're on Instagram the whole time. And they are Snapchatting, and they are Instagramming, and they are tweeting probably, although that doesn't sound so cool. Maybe they're not tweeting. But they're not talking to anybody. They're not dancing. They're not using the nightclub for what it was intended for, and you go in there and you just feel like all they're doing is like looking sad and then like making a fake smile for Instagram and then looking sad again. The people at Output have their phones in their pockets and they're actually kind of happy. So there's a rule that you could actually experience this rule several times and not even know why it was working, but somebody found it, and because it's non-obvious, not everybody's doing it, but they're being successful because of this crazy rule. So let's talk a little bit about the rules of Stack Overflow, because that's what I'm here for. And the non-obvious rules, I think, are some of the ones that come in that were very interesting, and they're a little bit complicated. So number one, I want to talk about two programming techniques, actually debugging techniques. There's a debugging technique which is called rubber ducky debugging, where you take a rubber duck like the kind you would have in your bathtub, and you put it on your computer, on the monitor, and when you have a problem with your code, you explain it to the rubber duck, all right? This is a real debugging technique. It's called rubber ducky. You try to say, okay, well, this is what I tried to do, and this is what happened, and you talk to the duck. And many people report this is actually a really good way to debug because as you try to explain it, you'll realize things about your code, and you'll realize what you should have done. And in fact, there's a specific version of, if you go Google this, you'll see the best way to debug something in your code or to find a problem is to describe what it is that you did, which is hard enough, what it is that you expected would happen when you did that thing. I wrote this code, I thought it would do this, that, and the other thing, and what actually happened. So just those three things. What did you do, what did you expect, and what did you get instead? Those three things, if you can even explain those, 93% of the time you've solved your problem, or at least you've gotten it to the point where you can Google the answer, or you've found the exact solution. And that's a common debugging technique, and I think most experienced developers know this, although maybe they don't literally have a rubber duck. They do try that exercise before they go to somebody else with a problem. And so we established a rule on Stack Overflow. It's not really a rule. It's how to ask a question. It's a blog post by John Skeet. And it sort of says, you know what? If you're going to ask a question on Stack Overflow, please tell us what you did and what you expected and what you got. And if those three things aren't there in your question, we probably can't help you. And then people look at this and they're like, I don't like that rule. That's not my favorite rule. I want to just be able to say, it doesn't work. I did this and it doesn't work. I don't need to say what I tried and what actually happened. That's no fun. You ask me, I'll tell you, I'll answer you. And those people don't get answers and they're sort of not successful. And we're sort of telling them, look, on Stack Overflow, please put these three things in your question. And if you do, you'll get an answer. And the reason we're telling you that is because 95% of the time, as soon as you just get your question into that form, you'll realize the answer yourself. You'll figure it out on your own. And all we're trying to do is teach you how to be a programmer so that the question that you leave behind can be useful to other people and so that you can solve your problems without resorting to typing questions on Stack Overflow, and then everybody's happier. So it's an example of sort of a not super obvious rule. There's another rule. It may even be more obvious, but there's a rule on Stack Overflow that says, please provide sample code, but reduce your sample code to the shortest possible code that illustrates the problem that you're trying to get help with. And that sort of seems obvious, but then a lot of people come on Stack Overflow and they're like, at this URL, you will find a zip file containing the complete source code to my entire project. Please help me debug it. It doesn't work. And that doesn't, and I think maybe they think they're being helpful. They're like, I'll give you all the information, It's like if I have, if I have a sore on my finger, I don't just send my finger to the doctor. I take my whole body to the doctor's office. And because maybe it comes from some other, who knows, I don't know about bodies. I'm not good. Why do we have that rule? We have that rule because there's a debugging technique called divide and conquer. And the debugging technique called divide and conquer says, take your code, all 8,000 lines, and there's some bug in it somewhere, and put a breakpoint on line 4,000 and just check if everything worked fine up until line 4,000 or if the problem starts after line 4,000. And then keep doing that again. And then, it was before line 4,000? Okay, what about line 2,000? Before or after line 2,000? And you keep dividing it in half. And in about 8 seconds, you get down to a single line of code. And you're staring at that line of code, and you're saying, I'm calling the set baud rate 9600 function. And it seems to be setting the baud rate to something much faster than that. And then you realize that the set baud rate function was written by a moron, and it's already dividing by 1,000 or something, and so whatever. And then you solve your problem. Because you've narrowed it down to one line of code and you've exactly figured out where the problem is. And so that's why the reason we say narrow it to the minimum lines of code, it's useful to us to help you with your problem, but also that's the way that programmers, professional, real working programmers, actually solve their problem. So we have that other non-obvious sort of rule, which is like, hey, yeah, I know. Nobody wants to obey the rules. Everybody thinks they're sort of special. Everybody kind of thinks like they're like, they think that they figured out something that we don't know about how Stack Overflow is going to work. I just went to this festival called Burning Man, and they have a rule that you have to take out all the garbage that you bring with you. And that seems like an obvious rule, but they're really strict. And they say, in fact, not only garbage, but any water that you used for washing. So if you brush your teeth and spit it out, that water, you have to take that home with you. There is no place to put it. There's no garbage cans, there's no da-da-da-da. You put it in a plastic bag, you take it on the plane if you have to, I don't care, but you get it out of there because we're gonna leave it. And then a bunch of people might think, oh, this is stupid, I just brushed my teeth, it's the desert. I can spit out the water on the desert, it will evaporate. And I don't know why, but no, you can't. You can't spit it out on the desert. It won't evaporate. There's no, the things that are supposed to biodegrade, there's no bio, because it's the desert, and so they're not going to degrade. And so you have to take it out, but that's not what matters. The thing is, that is the rule. And if you don't like that rule, like the rule has been established for a reason, and it's what makes the whole thing work. And people that have been doing this for 18 years created that rule, and there's no way that you're smarter than the 70,000 people that have been doing this for 18 years. So please just shut up and obey the rules. And that's sort of one of the weird things. And in fact, that's one of the things I think that makes the internet kind of tough, is figuring out all these rules and figuring out what they are and making online systems that really work. The last thing I want to talk about is really that internet toughness and how these rules kind of come across to people. And one thing that has come to the forefront really just in the last year or two, although we've known it all along, is that the field of programming for some reason and the field of creating software has somehow narrowed down to be predominantly a field of men and predominantly white men. And that's sort of strange, and nobody has a great explanation for that, but it's not working for us. So let's explain why this is a problem in the first place. The reason this is a problem in the first place is that the code is the script for the future. And it's very much like legislation. Like if I write some code that describes how an Uber is going to decide who to pick up and where it takes them, that in many ways then determines how the world will proceed from here on. And if you think about somebody working on a social network or somebody working at Facebook deciding what posts to show you, that stuff is really, really important, and it's starting to influence elections. If you think about whether a social network has a responsibility to reveal to the police the contents of private conversations that happen on the social network, or if you think about how banking systems work and whether people should be allowed to transfer money to other people without it being reported to the government. All that kind of stuff, these are decisions right now that are being made by programmers in code. A lot of times, they're very, very small decisions that add up to big things. Sometimes they're small decisions that don't add up to anything. Sometimes they're big decisions that add up to big things. But the decisions are just getting written by programmers, and nobody's thinking about them very hard. And in some of these cases, like the Facebook algorithm that is now mucking with elections, nobody thought about them at all. It never occurred to them that this could possibly influence elections. And so that's what I mean when I say the code is sort of the script for the future. When you write code, you're creating a script for the future. It will run without your involvement. It will have whatever effects it has without your involvement. And in those ways, it's a lot like a law that was passed by a legislature. Now, we figured out 200 years ago that it's a really good idea to have some kind of democracy and some kind of representational system so that the laws get passed work for everybody instead of just working for a small group of people. And we don't do that, but we figured out that we should. And I think the same thing applies for code. If you don't have representation in who's creating the code, and if you're not representing the whole world, first of all, your code is going to be dumb, and it's not going to be helpful to people. But kind of more than that, your code is going to drive the world in a way that really only helps one group of people while sort of ignoring the experience of a larger group of people. So for this reason alone, other than the social justice reason, for this reason alone, I think it's much more important that we get better representation in who participates in tech companies, who designs code, who writes code, and who participates there. But we are not there yet. Why not? Well, one of the things I think that happens is that when you arrive into the world of programming, when you take your first class at university in programming, and you look around in the room, if you're not in sort of the dominant group, you might feel like you're in the wrong place. And nobody will tell you that. And they could be very nice, and they could be very welcoming, but you just feel a little bit weird. I went to a One Direction concert. Does anybody know One Direction? This is already an old joke. So I'm gay, and I like One Direction. Sue me. But most of the other people who go to One Direction concerts, as I discovered, are teenage girls. I did not realize this beforehand, but I went to a concert with 60,000 people, like a giant football stadium in America, in Philadelphia. Like this huge football stadium, and everybody except for me and my 2 gay friends, everybody else was a teenage girl, or sometimes their parents, sometimes. And you could tell the parents because they were sitting down on their phone and not standing up. So I was the only adult male really standing up out of 60, 70,000 people. And I thought, this is fun. I'm enjoying this concert. But as time went on, I started to feel, I don't want to say I felt like a creep. Nobody was treating me like I was being creepy or anything. I just thought, I'm in the wrong place. There's no possible way that the right thing for me to do is to come to a concert in Philadelphia, and I live in New York, with 70,000 teenage girls. I must have gotten something wrong. There must have been some sign I didn't see saying, don't go here. And when I had that experience, I realized, that's the way it is. If you're a woman coding, for example, you might feel that way. You might feel like, hey, this is, nobody's told me, there was no sign, nobody did anything other than smile at me and was happy that I'm here. But somehow there's something kind of wrong about this. So that's the sort of the starting point, which is the lack of visibility of women and minorities in programming is already making it feel, I don't want to say unwelcoming, because again, it could be welcoming. It's making it feel like there's something amiss, something slightly wrong. And then I want to combine that with sort of another thing which happens, which is that programming is really, really hard. And it really, really depends on your being willing to just sort of plunge ahead despite the fact that it seems like, like a Sunday crossword puzzle. It seems like it's going to be impossible to ever get it right. And so when you go on Stack Overflow and you start asking questions because you're having trouble, which is what everybody does, if you already feel like you're in the wrong place and people are not super welcoming and friendly in the way that they answer the questions, you're much more likely to say, you know what, this is not for me. And something that opened my eyes is when somebody told me, I asked a question on Stack Overflow, and a person answered it right away, and they said, this is easy, period. And then they wrote the answer. And I thought, it's not easy. I've been working on this problem for 3 days. This is hard. I don't even understand the answer now that you've explained it to me, and I've cut and pasted it, and it worked. And I still don't understand it. It is not even remotely easy. And what did they think? They thought, look, I'm in the wrong place, and this stuff is too hard for me. And that can drive you out of the field, and that can make you want to quit. And so what occurred to me is that what we need to do on Stack Overflow is stop telling people that this is easy. We need to be positively welcoming. We need to be like 120% in the positive direction, not just the neutral, certainly not the negative. And so a lot of people, there was a lot of complaints around Stack Overflow of people saying, man, you're not welcoming to women and minorities and new programmers. You guys are really mean. And a lot of us at Stack Overflow, myself included, kept saying, show me. I don't see anybody being mean here. I can't find it. You can find it, but it gets deleted in 3 seconds because we got really good moderation. And if anybody ever wrote anything like rude or nasty or misogynistic, like, oh, well, if you weren't a girl, you'd be able to solve that problem. Nobody ever writes that. And if they do, it gets deleted in a millionth of a second. So I couldn't find it. And people said, no, it's not that. It's this is easy. Just saying this is easy is what's driving people away. So we've started a new project called the Welcome Wagon at Stack Overflow, and we've changed our terms of service a little bit. We've changed the way that we communicate with our community around how to behave on Stack Overflow, especially to newcomers and people who are learning how to program. And we're really going to work hard on this, and we have teams that are doing research and doing focus groups and kind of experimenting. And there's a lot of little knobs that we can adjust and a lot of little cute little machine learning games that we can play to hopefully make Stack Overflow as a whole a slightly more welcoming community to newcomers. And that's my hope, is that that's the project. We've been doing this for 10 years now. The project for the next 10 years is to say, what can we do with this platform, Stack Overflow, that so many people are using to learn how to code? What can we do with that to make it more welcoming and to bring in a more diverse group of people into programming for the future so that the code for the future doesn't look like the code for today? Thank you very much.